Aliens didn't know who would arrive. Until the Deathworlders from the galaxy appeared, the galaxy had known peace for centuries. The various species that populated the stars had long learned to coexist, each in their own corner of the universe. Some were powerful and ancient, while others were young and just beginning to explore the endless expanse of space. Among these races, the humans were seen as weak, struggling to survive on their fragile, resource-poor planet. They were an afterthought in the grand scheme of the galaxy, constantly watched by the alien powers who considered them little more than an annoyance. No one took humanity seriously, not until it was too late. Far from the bustling centers of galactic civilization, a young human colony had been quietly founded on a rocky world, a place that no one thought would be worth much. The settlers had come with high hopes, eager to carve out a life on a new planet, far from the political intrigues of the galaxy's ruling species. At first, the colony had flourished, but that didn't last long. The powerful alien races who watched the human settlement from afar quickly began to view it as a threat. The colony had resources, precious metals, vast underground lakes of water, and fertile land that could support agriculture. But more importantly, it had something the galaxy's rulers feared: the potential to grow stronger. The alien races didn't want that. They had already been manipulating the fate of the humans for years, sowing discord among the settlers, causing them to struggle with internal conflict, and sending spies to weaken their defenses. The Vieties, a race of aristocratic aliens with sharp, regal faces and intricate mental powers, saw the humans as a potential uprising waiting to happen. The Xanthians, insectoid and calculating, viewed the humans' reckless survival instincts as a dangerous wild card. Even the Sarathians, cold and logical, could see how humanity might one day disrupt the status quo. The time had come, they decided. They would strike before the humans could ever grow strong enough to challenge the established order of the galaxy. The alliance of aliens, which had long dominated the stars, would invade the human colony and wipe it out before it could grow into something dangerous. They had the ships, the weapons, and the armies to do it. What they didn't have, however, was knowledge of what was about to happen. Unknown to the Alien Council, something else was arriving, something no one had anticipated. The galaxy had always been a place of strange wonders, but this was beyond anything anyone had seen. Far beyond the reach of the neutral space lanes, in the void between the stars, an immense fleet appeared. It wasn't a fleet like any the aliens had ever seen. There were no sleek, elegant ships that radiated power with every curve and line. Instead, there were massive, blocky warships, each one a towering giant in the void. These ships were old, their surfaces battered and scarred from countless battles, yet their power was unmistakable. They had the unmistakable air of death. The aliens, watching from their council chambers on distant planets, were left in stunned silence as these strange ships drew closer. The ships did not announce themselves in the traditional manner. There were no elaborate signals, no grand messages of conquest. Instead, their arrival was silent, ominous. The first sign that something had changed was a burst of energy, followed by the arrival of these immense vessels, appearing from the deepest, darkest corners of space. For hours, the Council could only watch as the unknown fleet slowly positioned itself in orbit around the human colony. No one knew where they came from, and no one could recognize the insignia or markings on the ships. Some of the Council members whispered that perhaps this was a mistake, a fleet lost in the vastness of the galaxy. Others feared that the Deathworlders, those barbaric survivors of forgotten worlds, had finally found their way into galactic space. Rael, the leader of the fleet, was a man of immense stature and presence. His face was weathered with the scars of countless battles fought on worlds so harsh that only the strongest had survived. His eyes, dark and sharp, held the experience of a lifetime spent fighting for survival in the deadliest of environments. His people, known as the Deathworlders, were humans who had thrived on planets that were hostile to all life. They were a race forged in the crucible of survival, and their arrival in the galaxy signaled the beginning of something the aliens had never prepared for. The aliens had no idea who they were up against. The Deathworlders had no interest in galactic politics or the struggle for control. They had no desire for conquest, no thirst for power over the galaxy's many species. Their mission was simple: protect humanity at any cost. Rael's ship, the largest and most advanced of the fleet, moved into position above the human colony. A silent command went out to the crew, and a long line of small landing craft descended to the surface. The ships didn't fire weapons, nor did they send out waves of fighters. They simply landed, one by one, on the human colony's ruined surface, their engines glowing softly as they set down on the desolate ground. The first humans to see the Deathworlders were the survivors of the initial alien sabotage. These humans had been living in the shadows, struggling to survive as their world crumbled around them. When they saw the strange ships land, they thought they were hallucinating, perhaps seeing ghosts from the past. But when the first Deathworlder, a tall, imposing figure in heavy armor, stepped down onto the soil of their colony, the survivors knew they were not dreaming. The figure's face was hidden behind a helmet, but his presence was undeniable. The human survivors had no idea what to make of the situation. Fear gripped their hearts as they watched the strange, armored figures move with terrifying precision. These were not the typical aliens they had been dealing with. These were not invaders who wanted to exploit their planet or destroy them. These were something else entirely. Rael moved toward the survivors, his expression cold and unreadable beneath his helmet. He didn't speak at first. There was no need. The humans would understand, eventually, what he and his people were there to do. Rael's people, the Deathworlders, were not bound by the same rules of diplomacy that the rest of the galaxy followed. They didn't care for politics, for games of power, or for subtle manipulation. They only cared about one thing: survival, and they would fight for humanity to survive, even if it meant standing against the galaxy's most powerful races. In the silence that followed, the survivors began to move cautiously toward the Deathworlders. They were afraid, but there was something else too, a flicker of hope. They hadn't been forgotten after all. The galaxy's rulers had left them to die, but the Deathworlders had come. They had come to protect them. The aliens, on the other hand, had no idea what they were dealing with. They thought they had the upper hand, that they could strike whenever they chose, overwhelming the humans with their superior technology and numbers. But they had underestimated humanity, and worse, they had underestimated the Deathworlders. As the first signs of battle began to unfold, the alien council watched from their distant chambers, their hearts filled with dread. The Deathworlders had arrived, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The days following the arrival of the Deathworlders were tense and filled with uncertainty. The surviving humans on the colony were not used to having their safety guaranteed, let alone by a group of imposing figures from a fleet that came out of nowhere. Yet, despite the fear that gripped their hearts, there was a strange sense of relief. The Deathworlders didn't appear to want anything from them. They didn't want to conquer, exploit, or enslave them. They simply wanted to protect. Rael, the leader of the Deathworlders, was a man of few words. He didn't need to speak often. His presence alone was enough to command attention. The humans watched as he and his crew set up a perimeter around the colony. The warriors worked in silence, setting up fortified positions and scanning the sky for any signs of danger. The colony, once a thriving human settlement, had now become a battlefield, and the Deathworlders were preparing it for a war that the humans had not yet fully understood. The first night after their arrival, Rael gathered the human survivors in a small, abandoned building. The humans were a mix of settlers, some young and hopeful, others older, hardened by years of struggle. They had seen their world fall apart slowly, first with alien sabotage, then with their resources dwindling and their defenses crumbling. They had fought against the odds, but they were no match for the overwhelming power of the alien forces that were about to invade. Rael stood before them, his figure towering over the group. His armor was scratched and scarred from countless battles, but it was still formidable, and the humans couldn't help but be in awe of the man who wore it. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a symbol of survival, someone who had made it through the harshest conditions in the galaxy and come out victorious. He spoke to them, his voice calm but filled with authority. "We're here to protect you. But you must understand that we cannot do this alone. You are strong. You have survived this far, and now you will survive with us." Rael's words didn't immediately reassure the humans. They were still unsure. They couldn't understand why these strangers had come to their aid. Why would they help them? The galaxy had ignored humanity for so long. The powerful alien races that controlled the stars had never cared about them before. Why would the Deathworlders, these warriors from unknown worlds, be different? Rael seemed to sense their hesitation. He continued, "We are Deathworlders. We come from places where survival is a constant battle. Our worlds are not like yours. We do not live in peace. We fight every day for our lives, and we fight to protect those we care about." The humans looked at each other. Some were hopeful, others skeptical. They had no choice but to trust Rael and his people, for now. The following days were spent preparing for the incoming alien attack. Rael and his warriors didn't waste time. They organized the survivors into groups, training them in basic defense and survival tactics. It was clear that the humans were outmatched in every way. Their weapons were outdated, their technology inferior, and their numbers were small. But the Deathworlders were different. They weren't interested in advanced tactics or complicated strategies. They relied on sheer instinct and raw power. Rael led the training, showing the humans how to fight with whatever they had. He taught them how to use their surroundings, how to improvise weapons from the resources they had left. The humans weren't fighters by nature, but under Rael's guidance, they quickly learned to defend themselves. The Deathworlders didn't just teach them how to fight, they taught them to survive. It wasn't just about combat, it was about mentality. The Deathworlders had survived in the most hostile environments in the galaxy, and they wanted to pass on that mindset to the humans. Every lesson was a reminder of how fragile life was, but also how much potential the humans had to overcome any obstacle. For the first time, the humans began to see a flicker of hope. They weren't just waiting to die. They were preparing to fight. And maybe, just maybe, they could win. Rael didn't sleep much. He spent his nights on the perimeter, keeping watch over the colony, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. He didn't trust the aliens to hold off forever. They would come soon, and when they did, they would be relentless. The Deathworlders had arrived just in time to make a difference, but even they couldn't stop an invasion alone. The alien forces, the Xanthians, Viides, and Sarathians, had their sights set on the human colony. They had underestimated humanity for years, believing that the human race would never amount to anything. But they had made a grave mistake. Humanity was resilient, and it had something the other races didn't: the will to fight for survival. The Deathworlders had recognized that strength, and they had come to nurture it. The first sign of the alien invasion came 3 days after the Deathworlders had arrived. A fleet of sleek, advanced ships appeared in the sky, their engines roaring as they descended toward the planet. The humans had seen these ships before. They were the ships of the Alien Alliance, the same ones that had been spying on them for months. Rael's warriors were ready. They had set up barricades around the colony and prepared their weapons. The humans, although still new to fighting, stood alongside the Deathworlders, armed with whatever they had been able to cobble together. Their hearts pounded in their chests as the alien ships landed on the planet's surface. The Xanthians, insectoid and deadly, emerged first, followed by the Viides, their regal faces cold and emotionless. The Sarathians, calculating and precise, took their positions, ready to strike. Rael stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the approaching alien forces. He didn't need to say a word. His warriors knew what to do. They had trained the humans well, but they also knew that the time for preparation was over. Now it was time for battle. As the aliens advanced, Rael gave the order. The Deathworlders charged, their weapons crackling with energy. The humans followed, hesitant but determined. They fought alongside the Deathworlders, using their knowledge of the land and the teachings they had received. The Deathworlders fought with a brutal ferocity that stunned the aliens. They didn't care for tactics or strategy, they cared only about survival, and they fought as though their lives depended on it. The battle that followed was chaos. The Deathworlders were ruthless, cutting through the alien forces with precision and raw power. The humans, although not as experienced, fought with everything they had, fueled by the knowledge that they weren't alone anymore. They fought for their homes, for their families, and for the future of humanity. Despite the overwhelming odds, the humans and the Deathworlders pushed the alien forces back. The Xanthians, Viides, and Sarathians were shocked by the resistance. They had not expected such a fierce fight. They had underestimated the strength of the humans and the strength of the Deathworlders. The battle raged for hours, and when it was finally over, the humans stood victorious. The alien forces had been driven back, their ships damaged, and their troops scattered. The Deathworlders had shown the galaxy that humanity was not weak. They had proven that the human race could survive and that they could fight. Rael stood among the survivors, his eyes scanning the horizon. The battle was won, but this was only the beginning. The alien alliance would return, and they would come with even greater forces. But Rael and the Deathworlders were ready. They had shown the aliens that humanity was not to be underestimated, and they had shown the humans that they had something worth fighting for. As the survivors gathered, battered but unbroken, Rael's voice broke the silence. "This is just the start. The galaxy has seen what we can do, and we're just getting started." The humans, no longer the weak and fragile settlers they had once been, looked to Rael with newfound respect. They were ready to fight, and with the Deathworlders by their side, they had a chance to win. In the days that followed the battle, the human survivors found themselves in a strange, new reality. They had won, against all odds, but the victory had come at a high cost. The alien forces had retreated, but it was clear that this was only a temporary setback. The invaders would not give up so easily. They had underestimated humanity before, but now they knew better. And now they would bring everything they had to finish what they started. Rael stood among the survivors, watching as they worked to repair their damaged homes and fortifications. The humans had fought with courage, but they were not soldiers. They had little training, no advanced weapons, and no experience in warfare. But they had something else, the will to survive. Rael knew that this was their greatest strength. It was the reason he had come to their aid, and the reason he would fight for them until the very end. As the survivors worked, Rael and his warriors kept watch. The Deathworlders had no time to rest. The enemy would return soon, and they had to be ready. Rael spent his days coordinating the defense with his team, making sure that the humans were properly trained and armed. The Deathworlders didn't trust the humans to be as battle-hardened as they were, but they were determined to make them capable of defending themselves. They could not afford to be protective forever. The humans needed to learn how to fight, and they needed to learn quickly. For the first time in their lives, the humans felt that they were not alone. The Deathworlders did not treat them like children or helpless victims. They treated them as equals, people who could stand and fight alongside them. Rael, though a warrior of unmatched skill and experience, did not hide behind his armor or his strength. He worked alongside the humans, teaching them how to use their environment as a weapon, how to think quickly in the face of danger, and how to never give up. He showed them that it wasn't about having the best weapons or the most advanced technology. It was about the will to survive, about pushing through the hardest moments and refusing to surrender. The humans learned quickly. They adapted, taking everything Rael and his warriors taught them and using it to their advantage. They didn't fight like the Deathworlders. They couldn't. But they fought with the heart and desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. They fought for their families, for their homes, and for the future of their kind. Rael watched them with quiet pride. He had seen many species before, some of the strongest and most terrifying warriors in the galaxy, but none of them had the same raw determination that humanity had. In the face of overwhelming odds, when every other species would have folded, humans had stood their ground. He had fought alongside them, and he had seen it for himself. They were not weak. They were not powerless. They had simply been given the wrong impression. No one had ever given them the chance to prove their worth. But the Deathworlders had come, and they had given humanity that chance. The days passed, and the humans grew stronger. Their defenses became more organized, their weapons more effective. They had no illusion that they would be able to fight the alien alliance head-on, but they knew that they could hold their ground, and that was enough for now. Rael kept his eyes on the horizon, ever watchful for any sign of the returning fleet. The Deathworlders had arrived in time to save humanity, but the war was far from over. The alien forces were gathering, preparing to strike again with even greater force. The humans had made a mark, but that mark had drawn the attention of the most powerful and dangerous species in the galaxy. The galaxy was vast, and it was filled with enemies, many of whom were eager to wipe out the humans before they became a true threat. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rael stood alone outside the human colony. He stared into the sky, his thoughts distant. It was hard to believe that just a few days ago, this planet had been on the brink of destruction. Now it was a battleground, with every corner of the colony prepared for the next wave of attacks. The Deathworlders had taught the humans to survive, but there was something that Rael hadn't yet shared with them. The greatest danger wasn't the alien forces who sought to conquer them, it was something far worse. Rael had seen it before on many worlds. He had faced it in the darkest, most hostile environments. The true danger was not the known threats, but the unknown ones. The ones that came when least expected, when you thought you were safe, when you thought you had won. He had learned this lesson the hard way. It was something that had saved his life countless times, and something he would need to teach the humans before it was too late. As he turned to head back to the camp, a flash of movement caught his eye. It was a small group of alien soldiers moving swiftly through the shadows, their weapons raised. Rael's heart skipped a beat. They had returned. The aliens had come back, and this time they had brought reinforcements. He raised his hand, signaling to his warriors. The camp erupted into action as the Deathworlders and the humans scrambled to prepare for the coming assault. Rael moved quickly, directing the survivors to take cover and position themselves around the colony's defenses. There was no time for hesitation. The alien forces were upon them. The battle that followed was chaotic and fierce. The Deathworlders were relentless, their weapons cutting through the alien forces with terrifying efficiency. The humans fought with everything they had, using their makeshift weapons and the skills they had learned from the Deathworlders to hold their ground. It wasn't a clean fight. It wasn't easy, but they were ready this time. Rael led the charge, cutting through the enemy lines with his sword, his eyes scanning the battlefield for any sign of weakness. The humans fought beside him, their faces grim but determined. There was no fear in their eyes now. They had learned that fear was something you could conquer. The battle raged for hours, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. The Deathworlders were powerful, but the alien forces had numbers on their side. The humans, though fewer in number, fought with a desperation and fury that was unmatched. They didn't care about the odds. They cared about survival. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the alien forces began to retreat. The Deathworlders and humans had pushed them back once again. But it wasn't over. The aliens would return, and they would return stronger, more determined. Rael stood among the survivors, breathing heavily, his face covered in blood and sweat. The humans were exhausted, their faces marked with the signs of battle, but they were still standing. They had held their ground. As Rael looked out at the weary survivors, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had fought for their lives, and they had won. But he knew that the real battle was still ahead. The galaxy's most powerful species had already shown their cards. Now it was time for humanity to show theirs. Rael's voice rang out over the battlefield, his words carrying in the cool evening air. This is not over. They will come again, and we will be ready. The humans, battered but unbroken, nodded in agreement. For the first time, they didn't feel like victims. They felt like warriors, and with Rael and the Deathworlders by their side, they knew they had a chance. The war had only just begun. The days after the battle were filled with tension. The humans had managed to push back the alien forces, but there was no time to celebrate. The Deathworlders knew that the aliens would regroup, and when they did, they would come with even greater force. There was little time to rest. Every soldier, every civilian had to be prepared for what was coming. Rael's warriors worked tirelessly to fortify the colony, setting up traps and creating barriers with the resources they had left. The humans, once untrained and inexperienced, were now fighting alongside them, learning and adapting quickly. They had come a long way in such a short time, but they weren't ready yet, not for what was coming. Rael spent his days coordinating with his warriors, making sure that every defense was in place. His mind was always on the battle ahead, but his eyes often lingered on the humans, who were now working with determination and focus. They were no longer the helpless settlers they had been when the Deathworlders first arrived. They were warriors in their own way. It was clear to Rael that the humans had potential. They were resilient, adaptable, and they fought with a passion that was unmatched. As the days passed, the tension in the air grew thicker. The Deathworlders had pushed the aliens back once, but that victory was fleeting. It wouldn't be long before the alien forces launched another offensive. Rael could feel it in his bones. The galaxy's most powerful races were not going to let humanity escape so easily. They had underestimated the human race, but that mistake would not happen again. The aliens were coming, and they were coming in full force. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned dark, Rael gathered the survivors in the central building. The humans had been training hard, but they needed a leader. They needed someone who could guide them through what was coming, someone who could help them understand the gravity of the situation. Rael stood before them, his helmet under his arm, his face serious. He had fought in countless battles, but this was different. This was more than just a fight for survival. This was a fight for the future of humanity. "Listen up," he said, his voice strong but calm. "You've all seen what the aliens can do, you felt their power, but you've also seen what we can do. Together, we can survive this. We can fight back, but it's not going to be easy. The next battle will be harder, they'll come at us with everything they have. But we're ready." The humans stood in silence, their faces set with determination. Rail knew they were ready. They had learned quickly, and they had become something more than they had been before. They had learned to fight, to survive, and most importantly, they had learned to trust each other. "We will fight for our homes," Rail continued. "We will fight for each other. And we will fight for the future of humanity. We will not let them take what is ours." The humans cheered, their voices rising in unison. There was no fear in their hearts now. There was only a burning desire to protect what they had. They had nothing left to lose, and they would not go down without a fight. The Deathworlders worked alongside the humans, fortifying the colony's defenses even further. They set up communication lines, improved the weapons, and created strategies for the next assault. The humans, under Rail's guidance, helped wherever they could. They dug trenches, set up traps, and trained with their new weapons. Rail didn't ask for perfection. He asked for survival. He knew that no one could be prepared for what was coming. The only thing they could do was give everything they had and hope that it would be enough. The next few days were a blur of preparations. The aliens had been quiet since their last defeat, but Rail knew they were waiting, planning their next move. The calm before the storm was always the hardest part. It gave them time to think, to prepare, but it also made the uncertainty feel heavier. Rail couldn't afford to let the humans lose their focus. He pushed them harder, ensuring that every person knew their role and was ready to act when the time came. Then, on the fourth night after the first attack, the warning signs came. The first flicker of movement in the distance. Rail's sharp eyes caught the faint outline of alien ships appearing on the horizon. The time had come. The aliens were back, and they were coming in greater numbers. Rail didn't waste a moment. He gathered his warriors and the human leaders immediately, quickly making final adjustments to the defense plans. The humans were nervous, but they had learned to trust Rail, and they trusted each other now. They had come a long way since the first day they had met. They weren't the same people who had looked to the Deathworlders for guidance. Now they were part of the fight. The aliens were coming in waves, their ships descending like a swarm of locusts. They had superior technology, overwhelming numbers, and years of experience. But Rail and the humans had something the aliens didn't. They had unity, determination, and a reason to fight. They had the future of humanity in their hands, and they weren't going to let it slip away. The battle began as soon as the first alien forces landed. The Deathworlders engaged the enemy immediately, charging forward with brutal force. The humans followed, using the strategies they had been taught to hold their ground. It was a chaotic, desperate fight, but the humans fought with a fire that the aliens had never expected. They didn't fight like soldiers, but they fought with the intensity of those who had no choice but to win. Rail led the charge, cutting through the enemy lines with his sword, his eyes focused and determined. His warriors fought beside him, their weapons flashing in the night. The humans, though inexperienced, fought fiercely, using their surroundings to their advantage. They didn't have the same raw strength as the Deathworlders, but they had the will to keep going, no matter how many times they were knocked down. The battle raged on for hours. The humans and Deathworlders fought as one, pushing back the alien forces inch by inch. The aliens were relentless, but they had underestimated the human spirit. The human survivors fought as if their very existence depended on it, because it did. Every time the aliens pushed forward, the humans pushed back. Every time the Deathworlders cut down an enemy, the humans stood firm, refusing to let their colony fall. Rail's mind was focused on the battle, but his heart kept drifting back to the humans. They were the key to everything. If they could survive this, if they could hold their ground against the greatest forces in the galaxy, then maybe there was hope for them. Maybe they could prove that humanity was more than just a fleeting species, more than just a group of settlers fighting for survival. Maybe they could prove that humanity was worthy of its place in the galaxy. The battle was far from over, and it would take everything they had to win. The alien forces were relentless, and they weren't giving up easily. But Rail was certain of one thing: humanity had proven something to the galaxy that no one could ignore. They had proven that they were not weak, they were not helpless, they were survivors, and they would fight to the very end. The sky above was filled with the roar of battle. The aliens, once so confident in their power, were now beginning to falter. They had underestimated humanity, and they would pay the price for that mistake. The fight continued throughout the night, the sounds of battle echoing through the broken landscape. Rail stood at the front, his eyes scanning the field for any sign of weakness. The humans had fought valiantly, but there was no time for rest. The next wave was coming, and they had to be ready. The war had just begun, and humanity's future was still hanging in the balance. The war had raged for days. The sky above the human colony was filled with the smoke of battle, the air thick with tension and fear. The Deathworlders and the humans fought side by side, but each day seemed harder than the last. The alien forces had brought reinforcements, a fleet that dwarfed anything the humans had ever seen. The Deathworlders were doing their best to hold the line, but even they were struggling to keep up with the overwhelming force of the enemy. Rail had seen many battles in his life, but nothing like this. The humans had proven themselves resilient, but they were still outnumbered and outgunned. Every day, more of them fell. Every night, more aliens landed on the surface, intent on crushing what little resistance remained. Rail knew that if they didn't find a way to turn the tide soon, it would be over. But he also knew that the human spirit wasn't something that could be easily broken. It was what had brought them this far, and it was what would keep them going until the end. On the night of the 5th day, the aliens launched their most brutal assault yet. Their ships descended in a wave, blotting out the stars above. The ground shook as they landed, and the humans and Deathworlders alike braced for the coming storm. The first wave of aliens was massive, a terrifying array of war machines and alien warriors with weapons that could reduce entire cities to rubble. But Rail didn't flinch. He stood tall, his sword in hand, his heart focused on the task ahead. He gathered the survivors in a hasty meeting before the attack began, his voice steady and strong. "This will be our hardest battle yet. They're coming with everything they have, but we're not giving up. We'll fight until the last of us is standing, and even then we'll fight. We are not just defending our colony, we are defending our future." The humans, though exhausted, nodded in agreement. They had come so far, and they weren't about to give up now. The Deathworlders were ready, too. Their warriors stood alongside the humans, their weapons sharp and their faces set with grim determination. They had fought many battles in their time, but they had never fought for something so important. This was more than just a war for survival. This was a war for humanity's place in the galaxy. The battle began as the first wave of alien forces charged. The Deathworlders and humans met them head-on, their weapons clashing with the sound of thunder. The aliens came in waves, their numbers seemingly endless. But the humans fought back with everything they had, using their environment to their advantage. Rail and his warriors led the charge, cutting through the alien forces with precision and fury. The humans fought with raw determination, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. Rail had always believed in the strength of the Deathworlders, but it was the humans who surprised him the most. Their ability to adapt, to learn, to keep fighting no matter the odds, it was something he had never seen before. They had been written off as weak, as insignificant, but now they were proving everyone wrong. They were proving that even the smallest spark of defiance could ignite a fire that no force could put out. The battle stretched into the night, the air filled with the sounds of explosions, gunfire, and the clash of steel. The humans fought with everything they had, and the Deathworlders fought with them. Rail was everywhere at once, directing the flow of battle, cutting down enemies, and helping the humans hold the line. He could feel the weight of the war pressing down on him, but he didn't allow himself to falter. Not now, not when so much was at stake. By dawn, the tide of the battle had shifted. The alien forces, once so confident in their victory, began to falter. Their ranks were thinning, their advance slowing. The humans had held their ground longer than anyone had expected, and the Deathworlders had fought with a ferocity that left the aliens reeling. But it wasn't just their strength that had made the difference, it was their unity. The humans and the Deathworlders were not separate forces anymore. They had become one. They had fought together, bled together, and now they were standing side by side against an enemy that had underestimated them from the start. Rail surveyed the battlefield, his eyes scanning the horizon. The aliens were retreating, their forces in disarray. The humans had done it. Against all odds, they had won. But it wasn't just a victory for the humans, it was a victory for all of them. The Deathworlders had come to protect humanity, But in doing so, they had found something they hadn't expected, a race that was worth fighting for, a people who could stand and fight alongside them. The humans had proven that they were not weak. They had proven that they could stand against the galaxy's most powerful forces and win. Rael's chest swelled with pride as he watched the humans celebrate. They had done it. They had survived. But he knew that this victory was only the beginning. The war was far from over, and the galaxy had already taken notice of humanity's strength. The Deathworlders had come to protect them, but now the humans had earned their place in the galaxy. No one could ignore them anymore. They had fought for their survival, and they had won. But Rael knew that there was still much to do. The alien forces would regroup, and they would come back stronger than ever. They wouldn't stop until they had destroyed humanity once and for all, but Rael wasn't worried. He knew the humans had something that no other race in the galaxy had, the will to survive. It was something that couldn't be defeated, no matter how many battles they fought. The next few days were filled with cleanup. The survivors worked tirelessly to repair the damage caused by the battle, while the Deathworlders continued to fortify their position. But there was no time to rest. The war was far from over. The alien forces would return, and they would return with vengeance. But Rael wasn't worried. He had seen the humans fight, and he knew that they would continue to fight. They had earned their place in the galaxy, and no one could take that away from them. As the sun set on the colony, Rael stood at the edge of the battlefield, watching the stars above. The war had been long and hard, but humanity had proven that it was not to be underestimated. They had faced the greatest powers in the galaxy and had come out victorious. And though the future was uncertain, Rael knew one thing for sure. Humanity had found its place in the galaxy, and nothing could change that. He turned and walked toward the survivors, his heart filled with pride. The humans had done it. They had survived. And now, with the Deathworlders by their side, they would continue to fight. The war was far from over, but Rael knew that the humans would never give up. They would fight, they would survive, and they would thrive. And in the end, they would be the ones who shaped the future of the galaxy.